In this three-part video series, we're going to look at the homeostatic regulation of the male reproductive system, starting with the male gonads. So if you're not familiar with this word, gonads refers to the primary organ of the reproductive system, which in this case are the testes, also called the testicles. We regard the testes as the male gonads because they are used to produce sperm, which are the male reproductive cells that are used in reproducing, that being producing a baby. We know that sperm are the carriers of the 50% of your DNA that came from your father. Now, if we go inside and look at the structure of the testes, we can see that there are two different types of tissue, each of which have a different function in male reproduction. The first type of tissue we can see is this network of tubes that goes throughout the testes, and these are what we call the seminiferous tubules. Now, if we look at the first word, we can see the root of seminiferous is actually the word semen, referring to the fluid that males ejaculate out that contains sperm, and therefore we can conclude that seminiferous tubules must be involved in the production of sperm. Now, the process of producing sperm that occurs in the seminiferous tubules is the process that we call spermatogenesis. And if we look at the suffix of this word here, we see genesis shares the same root as the verb to generate, so we can conclude that spermatogenesis is the process of generating or producing sperm. We'll talk more on this later because it's actually a multi-step process. Now, if we return to the structure of the testicle, we can see that there is a second type of tissue that forms barriers in between layers of seminiferous tubules, and these are what we call the Leydig, named after the biologist who first described them, the Leydig interstitial cells. An interstitial is just a fancy word that means in between multiple cell layers. So again, we can see the prefix inter, indicating that we find the Leydig interstitial cells in between layers of seminiferous tubules. And the job of these interstitial cells is in the production of a chemical called testosterone, which is the primary male sex hormone. So if you think of all of the characteristics that distinguish biological males from biological females, those characteristics result from testosterone's effects on the male body. Now, when we talk about regulation, we need to focus on spermatogenesis because the process of spermatogenesis is not actually completed within the interstitial cells. Sperm actually looks something like this when they are produced in the interstitial cells, and we can see that they are missing their ability to move because they haven't grown their tail yet, and therefore immature sperm are not completely motile. Therefore, the immature sperm need to travel to this area here, which is technically on the outside of the testes, and this area is what we call the epididymis, and this is a word that I'm never completely sure how to spell because of the awkward combination of I's and Y's in it. Now, within the epididymis, this is where testosterone produced in the interstitial cells will actually migrate here and influence changes on the sperm that allow them to mature and allow them to be able to move by themselves as soon as they are ejaculated out of the testes. So let's take a look at the sperm and the different components of it when sperm mature. So if we look at the structure, we can see that the sperm is broken into three different locations. The first and most prominent of the locations is, of course, the head. Now, the most important structure within the head is the part that carries all of the male DNA, which will then combine with the egg's DNA in order to be able to produce a new offspring. And this, of course, is the nucleus. Sperm have nuclei just like any other cells that they use to store their DNA. Now, what all cells do not have, except for sperm, is a structure called an acrosome, which is usually found at the front of the head. And basically, inside of the acrosome is an accumulation of digestive enzymes that are used by the sperm in order to be able to enter the egg. So one of the reasons why one egg can only be fertilized by one sperm is that as soon as the first sperm uses its digestive enzymes in the acrosome to cut into the egg, the structure of the egg becomes more rigid and prevents any additional sperm from being able to cut their way in. And all of this is mediated through the digestion that allows the sperm to enter the egg, mediated, of course, by this acrosome. Now, the most obvious structure within a sperm cell is the very prominent tail, which is an example of a flagellum, which is a word that literally means whip, because it describes the whip-like motion that the sperm tail uses in order to move and propel the sperm towards the egg to get where it needs to go. Now, obviously, this tail can't function on its own. It needs energy in order to be powered, which means that this tail is going to need a constant supply of ATP, which actually comes from the remaining section, which is found in the middle between the head and the tail, not surprisingly what we call the sperm's midpiece. And the reason why this midpiece is able to supply ATP to the sperm is because that this is the location of the sperm's mitochondria, the organelle responsible for generating most of the ATP by the cell. Now, the reason why we need to talk about sperm structure is because sperm, as all sex cells are produced in humans, is produced through the process of meiosis, which is the form of cell division that allows sperm to reproduce and only contain 50% of the DNA of an adult human cell. And of course, the other 50% comes from the egg. However, meiosis is not enough in order to generate a fully mature sperm. The actual process, or completion rather, of spermatogenesis needs to be mediated by testosterone. It's only through the changes regulated by testosterone that a sperm is able to become a fully motile cell and actually perform its function as the carrier of the male's contribution to the DNA of an offspring. In the next video, we're going to look in detail about the puberty cycle and how a collection of regulatory hormones are used in order to regulate and control the production of both sperm and testosterone.